Section 57 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Section 57, Chapter 37, Part 1. After the narration of the events just detailed, the papers from which the life of Mr. Inglesant has hitherto been compiled become much less minute and personal in character, and when the narrative is resumed, a considerable period of time has evidently elapsed. It is stated that some time after the death of his wife, Mr. Inglesant returned to Rome, and assumed a novice's gown in some religious order, but to which of the religious bodies he attached himself is doubtful. It might be thought that he would naturally become a member of the Society of Jesus, but there is reason to conclude that the rule which he intended to embrace was either that of the Benedictines or the Carmelites. As will soon appear, he proceeded no farther than the novitiate, and this uncertainty, therefore, is of little consequence. It must be supposed that the distress caused by the death of his wife and child, and by his absence from them at the last, was one motive which caused Inglesant to seek in some Rome spiritual comfort and companionship from the Spanish priests Molinos, in which society he had before found so much support and relief. It was thought, indeed, by many beside Inglesant, amid the excitement which the spread of the method of devotion taught by this man had caused, that a dawn of pure light was breaking over spiritual Rome. God seemed to have revealed himself to thousands in such a fashion as to make their past lives and worship seem profitless and unfruitful before the brightness and peace that was revealed, and the lords of his heritage seemed for a time to be willing that this light should shine. It appeared for a moment as if Christendom were about to throw off its shackles, its infant swaddling clothes, in which it had been so long wrapped, and acknowledging that the childhood of the Church was past, stand forth before God with her children around her, no longer distrusted and enslaved, but each individually complete, fellow citizens with their mother of the household of God. The unsatisfactory rotation of former penitence and sinful lapse, of wearisome devotion and stale pleasures, had given place to an enthusiasm which believed that, instead of ceremonies and bowing in outer courts, the soul was introduced into heavenly places and saw God face to face. A wonderful experience in exchange for a lifeless formality and rule of communion with the Lord, with nothing before the believer as he knelt at the altar, save the Lord himself, day by day unshackled by penance and confession as heretofore. Thousands of the best natures in Rome attached themselves to this method. It was approved by a Jesuit father. The Pope was known to countenance it, and his nephews were among its followers. The bishops were mostly in favor of it, and in the nunneries of Rome the directors and confessors were preaching it, and the nuns, instead of passing their time over their beds and hours, were much alone, engaged in the exercise of mental prayer. It would indeed be difficult to estimate the change that would have passed over Europe if this one rule of necessary confession before every communion had been relaxed, and in the hope that some increased freedom of religious thought would be secured, many adopted the new method who had no great attachment to the doctrine, nor to the undoubted extravagances which the Quietists, in common with other mystics, were occasionally guilty of, both in word and deed. It cannot be denied, and it is the plea that will be urged in defense of the action of the Jesuits, That freedom of thought as well as of devotion was the motive of numbers who followed the teaching of Molyneux. That free speculation and individual growth could be combined with loyalty to acts and ceremonies, hallowed by centuries of recollection and of past devotion, was a prospect sufficiently attractive to many select natures. Some, no doubt, entered into this cause from less exalted motives, a love of fame, and a desire to form a party and to be at the head of a number of followers. But even among those whose intentions were not so lofty and spiritual as those of Molyneux, probably were, by far the greater number, were actuated by a desire to promote freedom of thought and of worship among churchmen. But it was only for a moment that this bright prospect opened to the Church. The Jesuits and Benedictines began to be alarmed. Molyneux had endeavored to allay the suspicion attached to his teaching, and diminish the aversion that the Jesuits felt towards him, by calling his book The Spiritual Guide, and by constantly enjoining the necessity of being in all things under the direction of a religious person. But this was felt to point more at the submission to general council than to coming always to the priest, as to the minister of the sacrament of penance before every communion, especially as Molyneux taught that the only necessary qualification for receiving was the being free from mortal sin. Suddenly, when the reputation of this new society appeared to be at its height, Molyneux was arrested, and Father Esparza, the Jesuit whose approbation had appeared before the Spiritual Guide, disappeared. What became of the latter was not known, but it was generally supposed that he was shut up between four walls, and at any rate he appeared no more in Rome. In the midst of the excitement consequent on these events, 70 more persons, all of the highest rank, Count Vesperiani and his lady, the confessor of Prince Borghese, Father Appiani of the Jesuits, and others equally well known, were arrested in one day, and before the month was over, more than 200 persons crowded the prisons of the Inquisition. The consternation was excessive, when a method of devotion, which had been extolled throughout Italy for the highest sanctity to which mortals could aspire, was suddenly found to be heretical, and the chief promoters of it hurried from their homes and from their friends, shut up in prison and in peril of perpetual confinement, if not death. The arrest of Father Appiani was the most surprising. He was accounted the most learned priest in the Roman college, and was arrested on a Sunday in April, as he came from preaching. After this, no one could guess on whom the blow would fall next. The Pope himself, it was reported, had been examined by the Jesuits. The imminence of the peril brought strength with it. The prisoners, it was whispered, were steady and resolute, and showed more learning than their examiners. Their friends, who were still at large, recovering from their first panic, assumed a bold front. Many letters were written to the inquisitors, advising them to consider well what they did to their prisoners, and assuring them that their interests would be maintained even at the cost of life. Nor did these protests end here. As soon as possible after the arrests, a meeting was held at Don Agostino's palace in the Piazza Colonna, to which ladies were summoned as well as men. There, in a magnificent saloon, amid gilding and painting and tapestry, whose splendor was subdued by softened color and shaded light, were met the elite of Rome. There were ladies in rich attire, yet in whose countenances was seen that refinement of beauty which only religion and a holy life can give. Ladies who, while appearing in public in the rank which belonged to them, were capable in private of every self-denial, trained in the practice of devotion and acts of mercy. There were nuns of the Conception and of the Palestrina, distressed and mortified at being compelled to return to their beads and to their other abandoned forms. There were present Cereri, Cardinal Bishop of Como, Cardinals Carpegna and Sigolini, and Cardinal Howard of England, the noblest and most spiritually minded of the Sacred College, Absolini and Colloretti, cardinals and fathers of the oratory, and Cardinal d'Estrees. Petrucci himself, the most prominent advocate of the Quietist doctrine, was in the room, though incognito, it not being generally known that he was in Rome. There were present many fathers of the oratory, men of intellect, refinement, and blameless lives. Don Livio, Duke di Seri, the Pope's nephew, was there, and the Prince Savelli, many of the highest nobility, and above 100 gentlemen, all of whom, by their presence, might be supposed to prove their attachment to the teaching of Molinos, their superiority to the sordid motives of worldly prudence and pleasure, and their devotion to spiritual instincts and desires. It would be difficult to imagine scenes more unlike each other, yet strange as it may appear. It was nevertheless true that this brilliant company, attired in the height of the existing mode, sparkling with jewels, and enriched with chastened color, might not unfitly be considered the successor of those hidden meetings of a few slaves in Nero's household, who first, in that wonderful city, believed in the crucified Nazarene. The addresses were commenced by the Duke di Seri, who spoke of the grief caused by the arrest of their friends, and of the exertions that had been made on their behalf. He was followed by other of the great nobles and cardinals, who all spoke in the same strain. All these speeches were delivered in somewhat vague and guarded terms, and as one after another of the speakers sat down, a sense of incompleteness and dissatisfaction seemed to steal over the assembly, as though it were disappointed of something it most longed to hear. The meeting was assured over and over again that extreme measures would not be taken against those in prison, that their high rank and powerful connections would save them. The Duke di Seri had expressly said that he believed his relation and servant, Count Vesperiani, and his lady would soon be released. The fact was, though the Duke did not choose to state it publicly, that they had been proscribed solely from information gained at their confessional, and this having been much talked of, the Jesuits had resolved, rather than bring any further odium on the sacrament of confession, to discharge both the lady and her husband at once. But though all this might be true, there was something that remained unsaid, something that was filling all hearts. What was to be the spiritual future of those assembled? Was this gate of paradise and the divine life to be forever closed? And was earth and all its littleness once more to be pressed upon them without denial and hypocrisy, and the petty details of a formal service once more to be the only spiritual food of their souls? Must they, if they resolved to escape this spiritual death, quit this land and this glorious church, and seek, in cold and distant lands and alien churches, the freedom denied by the tyranny of the leaders of their own? These thoughts filled their minds, and yet none had given them utterance, nor was it surprising that it should be so. Select and splendid as that assembly was, no one knew for certain that his neighbor was not a spy. As was soon known after, Cardinal d'Estrees, who sat there so calm and lofty-looking, furnished the principal evidence against Molinos, swearing that, being his intimate friend, he knew that the real meaning of his friend's printed words was that heretical one of which, in fact, Molinos had never dreamt. It was no wonder that the speeches were cautious and vague. At last Don Agostino rose, and in a quiet and unaffected tone requested a hearing for his very dear friend, the Cavalier di San Giorgio, one well known to most of them, whose character was known to all. End of section 57. Read by Elijah Fisher.